So Terry, you mentioned the timeliness of revelation.
Yes.
Can you tie it into current world events?
Good question. We talk about timeliness, and I mentioned earlier that humanity over its long evolution development, and we don't mean Darwin necessarily, okay, not that version, but we go from infancy to childhood to adolescence to maturity. And we mentioned that the conditions in each of these stages are different, and it requires a different approach if we're talking about education. Remember that the messengers are sometimes referred to as the perfect educators, the divine physicians. They know what humanity needs. They know what the prescription should be to carry man to the next level of civilization. And that civilization is based on transforming the individual soul and times the number of souls to the point where you can change the society to be more just. Now, Jesus, when he was asked, when shall these things be? They're talking about his second coming. He said, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, the stars shall fall from heaven. Now, there are some people who take these prophecies, if you want, these statements literally. But they are, remember, a Baha'i principle is the harmony of science and religion. If religion teaches something contrary to science, it's superstition. You cannot have the stars falling from heaven. It'd all be over, okay? And it has nothing to do with whether God can do it or not. We can't turn God into a carnival magician. He's not going to wipe out his greatest creation, which is the individual, the human being, okay? So we have a future. But that future depends on our level of education corresponding to where we are in our development. Let's use, for example, going from grade 8 to grade 9. If we go to grade 8, I move into grade 9, I am now subjected to a higher course of studies, more intricate, more knowledge. It builds on the past, but it's the next step. And that means that I don't reject the teacher of grade 9 because I'm in 10, or the teacher of grade 8 because I'm in 9. I wouldn't be there without the teacher before me. But it does mean if I stop at grade 8 and refuse to go on, what happens is that I start to unlearn things. Now, when Jesus talked about the sun being darkened, he was referring to the influence of revelation weakening, ceasing to exert its force. Okay, the moon shall not give its light. These are the laws. People stop obeying the laws. The stars are the leaders of religion. They fall out of favor. I'm not going to comment further on how that applies today. But one thing we do know is that if I stop at grade 8, I will not only unlearn, I will start manufacturing new ideas out of my own head. Okay, so what you see is the explosion of different sects in many faiths. Okay, I had a course of studies in 1982. There were 3,000 churches. Now, how did we get from one Christ, one Bible essentially, okay, to 3,000 variations on the theme? We got there because people presumed to have the authority to interpret, and that was never given to anyone. Never. So they started manufacturing things. They manufactured indulgences, they manufactured purgatory and limbo, and all kinds of things. And this is not meant to be a criticism, okay? Because, Abdu'l-Baha says, Christ is alive in the hearts of the believers. Well, we look at that one carefully, we see that when the sun darkens, the spirit leaves its previous form. And what I mean by that is, in every age, the spirit takes form. In the church, in the mosque, in the synagogue, in the temple. You follow? There's a social, and it's not simply a physical construction. It's a building plus all of the social implications that brings with it. When the new revelation comes, the spirit moves. You can still have very conscientious Hindus, Buddhists, okay, Christians, etc. But the Spirit has moved, and it has moved into the new covenant. The new covenant is that impulse that God has injected into the world through the manifestation, what we call manifestations, major prophets, These are the perfect mirrors of God through which we see the light and the heat of the sun, the knowledge and the love of God. And what happens is the impulse goes out from this new form to generate a reaction in all of creation, whether we heard about it or not. So, for example, women prior to this age were never equal. Never equal. They got their vote in Canada and the U.S. somewhere around 1920. Okay, and there are some parts of the world where they still don't have equality. Now, Abdu'l-Baha says women have always been equal. They didn't become equal in this age. They've always been equal. This is the age that must recognize it and act on it. He says they've always been equal, but they have been denied the opportunities of participation and education. Okay. Now, that came out in the Bob's time. That's 1844. The suffragettes start to march. People had dreams of equality before. They had hopes, the same as they had hopes for peace. Okay. The difference in this age is we have the implements by which we can put them into action. So the women got the vote, and we can see now what has happened. However, with every new revelation, we have to look at the symbol that's sometimes used. It's called either a way or a path. Now, the interesting thing about that symbol is a path presumes motion. It's going somewhere. There's a goal. Okay, you're not static. The goal is spiritual growth and a more enlightened civilization. But the path also has sides. Too far this way or too far that way, and you're off the path. You're in the land of Nod, as it's called, which is ignorance or lack of awareness. So all of these principles that Baha'u'llah announced are out in the world. But to know what the true applications are, how far you go one way or the other, you have to have the principle and the guidance of revelation. If you don't, you get what happened to, let's say, feminist studies, where you have three schools of thought. One, men and women are mutually hostile. There was a school saying that. Number two, they're absolutely the same, no difference. They've never been married. And number three, they're symmetrical, equal, but they're different, and they bring different strengths to society. And this last one, of course, is the Baha'i understanding. And it doesn't matter what the principle is. Environmentalism, there are teachings about environmentalism. That has split into extremes. Kindness to animals, that is split into two extremes. You see what I'm getting at? If you don't have the path, you don't have the guidance by which you know how far to go either way. So when we're talking about the world condition today, the sun is darkened on previous revelations. When that happens, you get night. Night is lack of awareness, ignorance, the lack of influence of the previous moral compass, if you want, or compasses, and what you end up with is greed, corruption, crime, even some forms of mental illness come from people being either oppressed, they don't understand the reality, the rise in youth suicide, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Now, this is an inevitable and necessary part of the process. That sounds a little harsh. But what I mean to say is, people only start to pay attention when things get really bad. If we know anything from history, is that we change through crisis. It takes a crisis to get us to wake up, to smarten up, and to pay attention. We're not paying attention yet, but we're starting to, because you'll hear conversations about disparity of wealth. You'll hear conversations about it's too late for pollution, for global warming. I don't want to get into that argument. You'll hear conversations about all kinds of things. Those conversations are the beginnings, the beginning awarenesses of issues that go right back to a clear spiritual principle. Once that dialogue starts, people will start looking for alternatives, because the options that they have are divisive, are highly politicized, and they haven't worked. We've tried every variation on the theme, if you want, politically, economically, and it hasn't worked. We're still a divided people. The cultural divide in even the most developed countries, is acute. We have the rise of, let me use one as an example, materialism. Materialism started in Europe, came to the United States where they refined it and exported it to the rest of the world. And the acute form of that is consumerism. We were told a long time ago, Jesus said, man does not live by bread alone. Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven. Because the physical reality around us is secondary to the primary one, which is the life of the soul. And the purpose of life is to acquire knowledge and virtues which we will need in the next world. In the same way we were growing arms and legs in our mother's womb, not for the use there, but for our use when we arrived in this plane of existence. So it is a hopeful faith, the Baha'i Faith. There's no cause for despair. The 20th century Abdu'l-Baha described as a century of light, and that's because in spite of all the genocides and the wars and the corruption, we had the rise of certain human rights. So it's ironic you get both at the same time. But that's always happened. Rome fell while Christianity grew. And you come to a point with the growth, the rise if you want, where people will see the difference. Will see a distinction. Will see something better than what they already have. So we're hopeful.